An investment in knowledge pays the best interest. There is something quietly radical about this idea. Most of us spend our days chasing things that lose value the moment we get them. A new phone, a higher title, a better apartment. But knowledge compounds. It grows with you, invisibly, over years and decades. Franklin lived this truth not as a theory, but as a daily practice, and it shows. This reminds us that what we put into our minds is never wasted. Even the book you read slowly, the podcast you half listened to on a commute, the conversation that made you think differently, these are deposits that pay you back for the rest of your life. Perhaps the most important investment you will ever make is the one no one else can see. Welcome to Life Wisdom. Before we go any further, I want you to take one slow breath. Just one. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let wherever you are right now be enough for this moment. Tonight, or this morning, or this quiet afternoon, we are going to spend time with one of history's most fully alive human beings. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston in 1706, the 15th child of a candlemaker. He had almost no formal schooling, and yet he became a scientist who reshaped our understanding of electricity, a writer who shaped the American character, a diplomat who helped birth a nation, and a philosopher of everyday life whose words still feel startlingly current. What makes Franklin different from many great thinkers is that he was not interested in wisdom as an idea. He was interested in wisdom as a practice. He kept journals. He tracked his own habits. He made lists of virtues and graded himself against them every single day. He was, in the most modern sense, someone obsessed with how to actually live better, not just think better. In a world full of distraction and noise, that practical sincerity feels like a gift. Today, through Franklin's words, we will look honestly at how we live and how we might live differently. Tell me and I forget. Teach me and I remember. Involve me and I learn. There is a difference between knowing something and understanding it in your body. Many of us were taught things in school that slipped away within a week. But the things we did with our hands, or figured out through trial and error, those stayed. Franklin understood this long before modern psychology gave it a name. He learned to write by copying essays and then rewriting them from memory. This invites us to consider how much of our learning is truly passive. We read articles. We watch videos. We nod along. And then the next morning, we cannot quite remember what we learned. Perhaps the deepest learning happens when we are genuinely inside an experience, not just observing it from a safe distance. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. This is one of Franklin's most quoted lines, and it is easy to hear it as a scolding. But I think he meant it gently. He was not saying that failure makes you a failure. He was saying that the absence of thoughtfulness tends to produce outcomes we did not want. Preparation is simply a form of respect for your future self and for the people depending on you. Many of us, myself included, have felt the quiet anxiety of showing up to something underprepared. That low-grade dread in the chest. Franklin saw that anxiety not as a character flaw, but as useful information. It is the mind's way of saying, next time, let's think ahead. Small preparations made daily can quietly change the shape of an entire life. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Now, before you roll your eyes, Franklin was not prescribing a rigid morning routine. He was pointing at something deeper. The idea that how we begin our days tends to shape the quality of our days. That a life of intention, of not always sleeping through what matters, tends to produce a certain richness. The health, the wealth, and the wisdom are almost side effects. This reminds us that rhythm matters. The body and the mind both respond to consistency. Not the rigid kind that punishes you when you break it, but the gentle, daily kind that gives your life a quiet structure to return to. Many of us feel most lost when we have lost our rhythm. Well done is better than well said. We live in an era of extraordinary saying. Social media is built almost entirely on saying. People share quotes about productivity without being productive. They post about kindness without being kind. Franklin saw this human tendency in himself and in others, and he returned again and again to the same corrective. Action is the thing. Everything else is just rehearsal. This invites us to consider the gap between what we say and what we do, not with shame, but with honest curiosity. Where in your life is there a distance between the values you express and the choices you actually make? That gap is not a sign that you are a bad person. It is simply where the real work lives. Energy and persistence conquer all things. Franklin said this not as a motivational slogan, but as an observation. He had watched himself and others long enough to see the pattern. Intelligence helps. Talent helps. Connections help. But the people who actually changed things, who built things, who saw ideas through to completion, they were almost always the ones who simply kept going. One more day. One more try. One more letter written by candlelight. There is something almost quietly spiritual about persistence. It asks you to trust that the effort matters even before the results appear. Many of us abandon things too early, not because we lack talent, but because we cannot yet see the shape of what we are building. Franklin's life is a reminder that the shape often only becomes visible much later. Lost time is never found again. Franklin was fascinated by time. He thought about it constantly. Not in a morbid way, but in the way that a person thinks about something they know is genuinely limited and genuinely precious. He once wrote that time is the stuff life is made of. And when you feel that truth, really feel it, your relationship to idle hours begins to shift. This reminds us that the cost of distraction is not just a few minutes. It is a small piece of the only life we will ever have. Perhaps this suggests that the question is not how we manage our time, but how we regard it. When we truly believe that our hours matter, we stop giving them away so freely. He that is good for making excuses is seldom good for anything else. This one lands with a quiet thud. Most of us are fluent in excuses. We have reasons for why this is not the right time, why the circumstances are against us, why we would have succeeded if only things had been different. Franklin was not unsympathetic to difficulty. He faced enormous difficulty himself. But he noticed that the habit of explanation, when it replaces the habit of action, tends to calcify into something permanent. This invites us to consider the excuses we return to most often. Not to condemn them, but to look at them clearly. Sometimes an excuse is simply an unacknowledged fear in disguise. And naming the fear is often the first step out of it. Diligence is the mother of good luck. We like to think of luck as something that happens to us. Something random. Something outside our control. Franklin had a different view. He believed that luck, more often than not, was the residue of effort. The person who shows up consistently, who prepares, who stays curious and available, that person encounters opportunities that the unprepared person simply cannot see. They look like luck from the outside, but they are not. This does not mean that hard work always produces what we hope for. Life is genuinely unfair in ways that effort cannot always overcome. But it does suggest that the posture of diligence changes what becomes possible. Many of us are waiting for luck to arrive. Franklin is gently suggesting that we might go and meet it. Either write something worth reading or do something worth writing. This is one of my favorite Franklin lines. It is both a challenge and an invitation. He is not saying everyone must be famous. He is asking, are you living a life with enough substance to fill a page? Are you engaged with your days in a way that would make a good story? Or are you mostly scrolling, mostly waiting, mostly postponing the part where things get interesting? Many of us, myself included, have seasons of life where very little is happening. Where we are, in between things, waiting for the next chapter to begin. Franklin's words suggest that perhaps the next chapter begins when we decide to do something, anything worth noticing. The life worth writing about is built one small decision at a time. Dost thou love life? Then do not squander time, for that is the stuff life is made of. There it is again. That obsession with time. Franklin wrote this in Poor Richard's Almanac, and it has a quality of quiet urgency that never quite ages. Because the truth it contains does not change. Every hour we spend in a state of numbness or avoidance is an hour of life we did not actually live. And those hours add up. They become years. This reminds us that loving life is not a feeling. It is a practice. It looks like attention. It looks like showing up for the small moments rather than saving all your presents for the big ones. The stuff life is made of is mostly ordinary. And yet that ordinariness, when we are present to it, turns out to be the whole of it. Without continual growth and progress, such words as improvement, achievement, and success have no meaning. Franklin was deeply skeptical of stagnation. Not because he thought rest was wrong, but because he saw the difference between resting and drifting. Resting is intentional. Drifting is what happens when we stop directing our own lives and simply let circumstances carry us along. He believed that a life without some kind of growth, however modest, tends to feel hollow from the inside. This invites us to consider what growth means right now, in this season of your life. It does not have to be dramatic. It might be reading one more book than last year, having one more honest conversation than you would have otherwise, trying one thing that makes you slightly uncomfortable. The direction matters more than the speed. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Franklin had a sharp wit, and this is one of his driest observations. He spent decades in politics, diplomacy, and public life. He saw firsthand how rarely secrets stayed secret. And beneath the humor is something worth taking seriously. What we share tends to travel further than we intend. Our words, our complaints, our private confessions, they have a way of finding their way back. This reminds us to be thoughtful about what we speak and to whom. Not out of paranoia, but out of a kind of relational wisdom. The people we are most tempted to confide in during a moment of frustration may not always be the safest containers for what we share. Franklin learned this the hard way, multiple times. Beware of little expenses. A small leak will sink a great ship. This line was written about money, but it applies to almost everything. Small complaints accumulate into resentment. Small inattentions accumulate into distance in relationships. Small daily choices, the ones we think are too minor to matter, quietly determine the direction of a life. Franklin saw the aggregate long before most people were paying attention to the individual drops. Perhaps this suggests that the most important discipline in life is not the dramatic, visible kind. It is the small, unglamorous, daily kind. The decision to spend 5 minutes on something worthwhile instead of 5 minutes on something empty. Done once, it means nothing. Done every day for a year, it becomes a different life. A place for everything, everything in its place. This is practical wisdom in its purest form. Franklin believed deeply in order not as a virtue for its own sake, but because he noticed that disorder was expensive. It cost time. It cost energy. It cost the kind of mental clarity that good work requires. A disorganized life tends to produce a low-grade anxiety that sits in the background of everything. Many of us live surrounded by a kind of ambient chaos, inboxes overflowing, surfaces cluttered, digital lives sprawling in every direction. This reminds us that the small act of putting things back where they belong is not about perfectionism. It is about respecting your own future self, the person who will look for those things tomorrow morning. Do not anticipate trouble or worry about what may never happen. Franklin worried less than you might expect for a man carrying so much responsibility. He seemed to understand that most of what we dread never actually arrives. And when it does, it rarely takes the exact form we imagined. The mind's worst-case scenarios are often far more exhausting than the actual difficulty would be. This invites us to consider how much of our mental life is spent in imagined futures that never come. The anxious rehearsal. The silent argument with someone who has not yet said the thing we fear they will say. Franklin does not dismiss worry entirely. He simply suggests that worry, when it becomes habitual, begins to steal from the present without protecting the future. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. Even Franklin's most famous quip contains a kind of philosophical weight. He was not being nihilistic. He was being honest. And there is something quietly liberating about honest acknowledgement of what is truly fixed versus what is merely assumed to be fixed. Most of what we treat as certain is not. Most of what we fear is not inevitable. And most of what we are attached to is already changing. This reminds us that impermanence is not a problem to be solved. It is the condition of being alive. Franklin seemed to hold this fact lightly, with humor rather than despair. That lightness, the ability to see clearly without being crushed by what you see, is perhaps one of the most underrated forms of wisdom. Honesty is the best policy. Simple. Almost too simple. And yet most of us know from our own experience how often we choose something other than honesty. The white lie that spares someone's feelings. The softened truth that protects the relationship. The silence that avoids the confrontation. Franklin was not naive about the social complexity of truth-telling. But he kept returning to honesty as a foundation because he saw what happened to people who built their lives on something else. This invites us to consider where we might be choosing comfortable falsehood over uncomfortable truth. In our relationships, in how we describe our own lives to ourselves. The slow work of becoming more honest, not brutal, but genuine, tends to produce a kind of interior quiet that dishonesty never can. If you would know the value of money, go and try to borrow some. Franklin grew up without much money and spent his early life keenly aware of its weight. This line is funny on the surface, but underneath it is a real insight about how abstraction breeds carelessness. When money or time or energy or another person's attention feels unlimited, we treat it as though it costs nothing. The experience of scarcity teaches a kind of attentiveness that abundance rarely does. Perhaps this suggests that the things we take for granted are almost always the things we have never had to live without. This is true of money. It is equally true of health, of friendship, of peace, of time. The value of something often only becomes clear at the moment we realize it could disappear. Your net worth to the world is usually determined by what remains after your bad habits are subtracted from your good ones. This is Franklin at his most arithmetical and at his most honest. He was fascinated by the mechanics of self-improvement, and he believed that moral and practical virtues could be tracked, measured, and cultivated like any other skill. But this line cuts deeper than self-help. It asks us to look at the whole ledger, not just the highlights. Many of us are aware of our good qualities. We are somewhat less aware of the patterns that quietly undermine them. The bad habit we have rationalized. The reactive tendency we have not yet addressed. This reminds us that growth is not just about adding good things. It is also about subtracting the things that are slowly costing us. Life's tragedy is that we get old too soon and wise too late. There is a melancholy in this line that feels very human. Franklin wrote it late in his life, when he had finally accumulated the wisdom he had spent decades seeking. And what he saw, looking back, was the peculiar cruelty of the arrangement that the understanding needed to live well tends to arrive only after most of the living has already been done. This reminds us that the wisdom available to us now, through books, through conversations, through the experiences of people who have lived longer than us, is a genuine gift. We do not have to wait to accumulate all of it firsthand. Perhaps this is why listening matters so much. Borrowed wisdom, absorbed early enough, can change a life. Content makes poor men rich. Discontent makes rich men poor. Franklin spent time among both the very poor and the very wealthy. And he noticed something that still surprises people when they encounter it firsthand. Contentment is not the result of having enough. It is a disposition, a practice, a kind of inner arrangement that some people carry and others do not, regardless of what they own. This invites us to consider our own relationship with enough. Most of us are living with more material comfort than the vast majority of humans who have ever lived. And yet the feeling of not enough tends to follow us anyway. Perhaps the question is not how to get more, but how to genuinely receive what is already here. He that can have patience can have what he will. Patience is one of Franklin's recurring themes. He was not a naturally patient man by his own account. He was ambitious and driven and eager. But he came to see patience as a kind of strategic wisdom. The person who can wait, who can tolerate the slow accumulation of effort without demanding immediate results, tends to outlast those who cannot. This reminds us that most things worth having require a longer timeline than we want them to. Relationships deepen slowly. Skills are built over years. Reputations are formed through thousands of small interactions. Patience is not passive. It is the active choice to keep working without needing to see the finish line yet. By the collision of different sentiments, sparks of truth are struck out. Franklin loved conversation and disagreement. He helped found a debate club in Philadelphia when he was young, a group of tradespeople who met regularly to argue ideas. He believed that truth was more likely to emerge from the friction of opposing views than from the comfort of a single perspective. He was, by temperament, a pluralist. This invites us to consider how we respond to disagreement. There is a temptation, especially now, to surround ourselves only with opinions we already hold, to curate a world that confirms what we already believe. Franklin would have found this deeply counterproductive. Perhaps the conversation that unsettles us the most is also the one most worth having. He that speaks ill of the mare will buy her. This is one of Franklin's more playful proverbs. It is the observation that what we criticize loudest is often what we secretly want, or secretly fear, or secretly recognize in ourselves. The man who mocks someone's ambition may be mourning his own. The woman who judges another's choices may be quietly questioning her own. This reminds us to treat our strongest criticisms as diagnostic tools. Not always. Not mechanically. But sometimes, the thing that irritates us most in another person is pointing at something unresolved in us. Franklin understood human nature with a generous, unsentimental clarity that is rare in any era. Laziness travels so slowly that poverty soon overtakes it. Franklin grew up watching his father work hard, with very little margin for error. He understood poverty not as an abstraction but as a daily reality. And while he never blamed the poor for poverty, he was a genuinely compassionate man. He did believe that the habit of delay and avoidance tends to compound over time in ways that are difficult to reverse. Perhaps this suggests that the small motivations we feel in the morning, the impulse to do the thing we have been putting off, are worth following more often than we do. Not because the world rewards effort fairly, but because the alternative, the slow drift of postponement, tends to close doors without announcing it. Speak little, do much. Franklin was a gifted writer and speaker. He knew the power of words. And perhaps precisely because he understood what words could do, he was also alert to how easily they became a substitute for action. Talking about the project is not the same as building it. Describing the relationship you want is not the same as showing up for the one you have. This invites us to notice, today or this week, where our words might be doing the work that only our actions can do. There is a kind of energetic substitute that happens. We feel the satisfaction of articulating a goal and then forget to pursue it. The satisfaction of the saying fills the space where the doing should live. If passion drives you, let reason hold the reins. Franklin was not a cold man. He felt things deeply. He loved, he grieved, he was moved by beauty and injustice. But he also trusted reason in a way that the 18th century was just beginning to explore. He believed that feeling without thinking tended to lead people into trouble. And he applied this belief to himself, not just to others. Many of us, myself included, have made decisions in the heat of an emotion that we later regretted. The angry message sent before the feelings had settled. The impulsive choice made from a place of fear or desire rather than reflection. Franklin is not asking us to suppress our passions. He is simply asking us to not let them drive alone. A penny saved is a penny earned. Everyone knows this line. Very few people know that it means something slightly different than how it is usually quoted. Franklin was saying that saving and earning are equivalent acts. That the discipline of not spending is as valuable as the effort of earning. In an age of instant purchasing and frictionless consumption, this observation has taken on a strange new weight. This reminds us that financial behavior is a mirror of something deeper, our relationship with desire, with deferred gratification, with the difference between what we want right now and what we want for our lives overall. Franklin was not preaching thrift for its own sake. He was pointing at a kind of patience that extends far beyond money. There are three things extremely hard: steel, a diamond, and to know oneself. This is Franklin at his most philosophical. The man who tracked his own virtues daily, who wrote extensively about self-improvement, who spent a lifetime trying to become better. This man admitted that self-knowledge is among the hardest things a person can pursue. Perhaps because the self we are trying to know keeps changing. Or perhaps because the act of looking honestly at ourselves requires a courage that is genuinely difficult to sustain. This invites us to consider what we might not yet know about ourselves. The pattern we have not yet noticed. The fear underneath the confidence. The longing beneath the busyness. The work of self-knowledge is never finished. But it is always worth continuing. The doors of wisdom are never shut. There is something generous about this line. Franklin did not believe that wisdom was reserved for the formally educated, the wealthy, or the young. He himself had barely any formal schooling and became one of the most learned people of his era. He read constantly. He observed constantly. He asked questions constantly. He believed that the world is always teaching to anyone willing to pay attention. Perhaps this suggests that wherever you are in your life, however old, however little formal education, however uncertain, the door is still open. The invitation is still extended. Learning is not something that happens in specific buildings at specific ages. It is a posture toward life that either stays open or gradually closes, depending on the choices we make every day. When in doubt, don't. Such a small piece of advice. And yet Franklin returned to it repeatedly, because he noticed something important. That most of our regrets involve things we did, not things we left undone. That the action taken in a moment of uncertainty tends to carry more risk than we realize in the moment. That the quiet feeling of doubt is worth listening to, rather than overriding. Many of us have trained ourselves to push through doubt, to take action anyway, to not let hesitation stop us. And sometimes this is exactly right. But Franklin's observation suggests that doubt itself carries information. It is not always fear. Sometimes it is wisdom in its earliest, quietest form. To succeed, jump as quickly at opportunities as you do at conclusions. This is Franklin with a slight sharpness to him. He noticed that people are often very quick to reach conclusions about other people, about situations, about what is possible or impossible, and much slower to act when opportunity actually presents itself. The same mental quickness that produces judgment could also be used to produce movement. This invites us to consider our own pattern. Are you someone who decides things quickly but moves slowly? Who sees what others cannot, but hesitates to act on what you see? Franklin thought that the capacity for discernment, when it runs ahead of the willingness to engage, tends to produce a kind of brilliant inertia. Seeing clearly is only the first step. It takes many good deeds to build a good reputation, and only one bad one to lose it. Franklin understood reputation as a long-term construction project. He saw it built one conversation, one decision, one interaction at a time. And he saw it collapse sometimes almost overnight through a single act of carelessness or dishonesty. The asymmetry is real. And it is not simply about public image. It is about the trust we hold with the people closest to us. This reminds us that consistency is a form of generosity. When people can predict that we will behave with integrity, not perfectly, but reliably, they can relax around us. And that relaxation is one of the great gifts one person can offer another. Trust is slow to build and quick to break. Franklin lived inside that reality every day. He that falls in love with himself will have no rivals. There is wit here, but also a gentle warning. Franklin observed that self-absorption is its own kind of isolation. The person who is most interested in themselves tends to find the world growing smaller, fewer genuine connections, less real feedback, less contact with anything truly outside their own reflection. The paradox is that self-love, when it becomes self-centeredness, produces loneliness. This invites us to consider where our attention flows most naturally. Toward others, their stories, their inner lives, their needs, or, mostly inward, to our own feelings, our own narrative, our own perception of how things are going. Franklin was not self-effacing. But he was genuinely curious about other people. And that curiosity, that outward turn, is what made him genuinely beloved. One today is worth two tomorrows. We are very good at tomorrow. We save our real effort for when conditions are better. We tell ourselves we will begin when things slow down, when we feel more ready, when circumstances align more favorably. Franklin saw through this with a clarity that can be uncomfortable. Tomorrow always costs more than today. Because today is real, and tomorrow is still just an idea. Perhaps this suggests that the willingness to act now, even imperfectly, even incompletely, is more valuable than the most elaborate plan for a future that has not yet arrived. The imperfect beginning made today is already worth more than the perfect beginning imagined for tomorrow. He that would live in peace and at ease must not speak all he thinks or judge all he sees. This is Franklin the diplomat, the man who spent years navigating the courts of Europe, mediating between powerful and difficult people. He learned that restraint, knowing what not to say, choosing when to withhold judgment, was not dishonesty. It was a kind of social wisdom that allowed relationships and negotiations to survive. Many of us struggle with this. We have a strong reaction and we feel compelled to voice it. We notice something and feel that noticing it requires commenting on it. Franklin is gently suggesting that not every thought needs an audience, that the discipline of silence is as valuable in its way as the discipline of speech. Nothing is more fatal to health than an overcare of it. Franklin had a subtle understanding of anxiety about health and about life more broadly. He noticed that the person who is most obsessed with avoiding risk sometimes fails to actually live. That constant vigilance, constant optimization, constant worry about the body or the future can become its own form of suffering. Life requires a certain amount of unself-conscious engagement to be genuinely felt. This reminds us that there is a version of self-care that has crossed into self-monitoring, a version of wellness culture that produces more anxiety than health. Franklin is not advocating recklessness. He is simply observing that some of the best living happens when we stop watching ourselves quite so closely. He that waits upon fortune is never sure of a dinner. Franklin believed in making things happen. Not in an aggressive or domineering way, he was too sophisticated for that. But he distrusted passivity. He noticed that people who waited for circumstances to arrange themselves favorably tended to wait for a very long time, while people who moved, who tried, who made their intentions visible to the world tended to encounter more of what they were hoping for. This invites us to consider where we might be waiting when we could be moving. Not recklessly, not without thought, but with a gentle willingness to take the first step before we are entirely sure of where it leads. If you would persuade, you must appeal to interest rather than intellect. Franklin was one of the great communicators of his era. He wrote, he negotiated, he debated, he charmed. And over time he developed a clear-eyed understanding of how people actually change their minds. It is rarely through pure argument. More often, it is through connection, through feeling understood, through seeing how an idea serves their own life and values. Logic is necessary but rarely sufficient. This is perhaps more relevant now than ever. We live in an era of extraordinary argument, online debates, comment sections, political rhetoric that produces almost no genuine persuasion at all. Franklin's observation suggests that the question to ask before any important conversation is not, how do I prove my point, but how do I make this person feel genuinely seen? Games lubricate the body and the mind. Franklin played chess, swam, and engaged in recreational activity throughout his life. He did not see leisure as a weakness or an indulgence. He saw it as maintenance. The mind, like the body, requires activity that is not oriented toward productivity. Play, genuine, purposeless, enjoyable play, restores something that serious work depletes. This reminds us that rest is not the opposite of effort. Recreation is not wasted time. The hours spent in genuine enjoyment, laughter, games, movement, music, tend to return more than they cost. Perhaps the most efficient people are not the ones who never stop working, but the ones who know how to truly rest. There was never a good war or a bad peace. Franklin wrote this in a letter near the end of his long life. He had seen the Revolutionary War from the inside. He had lost friends. He had watched young men die for principles he deeply believed in. And even so, perhaps because of what he had witnessed, he arrived at a pacifist conclusion that is more radical than it first appears. This invites us to consider the conflicts in our own lives with a similar sobriety. Not the wars between nations, but the smaller ones between family members, between colleagues, between old friends. How many of those conflicts, even the ones we eventually won, were truly worth their cost? Franklin is asking whether we have given peace the same energy we give to winning. The noblest question in the world is, what good may I do in it? This is perhaps Franklin's most tender line. For all his pragmatism, all his wit, all his scientific curiosity, he kept returning to this: the animating question of a life well lived. Not, how much can I achieve? Not, how will I be remembered? But simply, what good can I do, here, now, in the world I find myself in? Many of us, myself included, lose touch with this question in the daily rush of obligations and distractions. This reminds us that goodness does not require a grand stage. It can be practiced in a 5-minute phone call to someone who is struggling, in the way we speak to a stranger, in the decision to show up when it would have been easier to stay away. An egg today is better than a hen tomorrow. Franklin loved this kind of proverb, concrete, slightly agricultural, pointing at something universal. The sure thing in hand now is worth more than the promised thing in the future. Not because the future is worthless, but because the future is uncertain. This is not a counsel against planning. It is a counsel against the habit of sacrificing the present entirely on the altar of an imagined tomorrow. This invites us to consider what is already here, already available, already good. The relationship that does not need to wait until you are less busy. The conversation that does not need to wait until conditions are perfect. Sometimes the richest life is assembled from things that are already within reach. Wish not so much to live long as to live well. Franklin lived to 84 years, which was extraordinary for his era. And I think he would say that the length was secondary to what was done inside it. He was curious until the end. He was writing until the end. He was still making connections, still asking questions, still caring about the world. That quality of engagement, not length, but depth, is what he believed made a life genuinely long. This reminds us that the question is not how many years we get, but what we actually do with the years we have. A long life spent in avoidance is shorter, in the ways that matter, than a shorter life lived with genuine presence. Franklin is asking us to tend to the quality of our living, not just its duration. The way to see by faith is to shut the eye of reason. Franklin was a complex figure on matters of religion. He was not a traditional Christian, but he was deeply spiritual in his own way. And this line reveals something interesting. He believed that faith and reason operated in different registers. That sometimes the analytical mind must quiet itself for a different kind of knowing to become possible. This invites us to consider the moments in our own lives when we have known something without being able to explain it. When a decision felt right before the logic supported it. When a relationship felt important before the evidence was there. Franklin did not dismiss this. He simply recognized that the eyes of reason sometimes need to close before other things can be seen. Wine is constant proof that God loves us and loves to see us happy. Franklin was also a man who enjoyed life. He appreciated good food, good wine, good conversation, and good company. He did not believe that wisdom required asceticism. He found evidence of grace in the simple pleasures, in the fact that the world had been arranged to include things that taste wonderful and make people laugh. This reminds us that delight is not a distraction from a serious life. It is evidence of one. The capacity to genuinely enjoy something, a meal, a friendship, an evening, a piece of music, is itself a form of gratitude. Franklin seemed to move through the world with an appetite for it that never quite dimmed. How few there are who have courage enough to own their faults, or resolution enough to mend them. Franklin tracked his own faults systematically. He had a list of 13 virtues and graded himself against each one every week. He was not doing this to shame himself. He was doing it because he genuinely believed that the honest recognition of a fault was the beginning of changing it. The courage to look clearly came first. Then the resolution to act. Perhaps this suggests that self-knowledge and self-improvement are not separate projects. They are sequential ones. We can only meaningfully change the things we are willing to honestly see. And the seeing, the clear-eyed, non-defensive acknowledgement that something in us is not yet what we want it to be, turns out to be the harder step. Read much, but not many books. Franklin preferred depth to breadth. He was not interested in accumulating titles. He was interested in understanding. He would read the same text multiple times. He would take notes, argue with the author in the margins, apply the ideas to his own life. He believed that a few books read deeply did more for a person than many books read superficially. This invites us to consider our own relationship with reading and learning. In an era of infinite content, the temptation is always toward more articles, more podcasts, more perspectives. But perhaps the most valuable thing we can do with a genuinely good idea is to sit with it long enough for it to change us. That takes time. It takes repetition. It takes more than a single pass. We are all born ignorant, but one must work hard to remain stupid. There is a gentle provocation in this line. Franklin believed that ignorance was a starting condition, not a permanent one. And he observed, with some humor, that the people who remained ignorant in adulthood had usually made a series of small choices in that direction. The refusal to read, the dismissal of unfamiliar ideas, the comfort of staying only where your current understanding already reaches. This reminds us that curiosity is not a personality trait you either have or do not have. It is a practice, a daily decision to remain open to what you do not yet know. Many of us, myself included, have seasons where we stop learning without quite noticing. And the world quietly narrows around us while we are not paying attention. Genius without education is like silver in the mine. Franklin had enormous respect for raw potential. But he also saw, repeatedly, how potential unrealized tends to stay exactly where it started. The brilliant person who never developed their gift. The talented young mind that received no encouragement or structure. Natural ability, without cultivation, remains underground, real but inaccessible, valuable but unused. This invites us to consider what in us might still be waiting to be developed. Not necessarily formal education, but some form of intentional cultivation. A skill practiced consistently. A talent taken seriously. The process of refinement, slow, unglamorous, requiring patience, is what turns the raw into the usable. Drive thy business, or it will drive thee. Franklin watched many people lose control of their own working lives. They started something with intention and purpose. And gradually, the thing took over. The business, the career, the obligations, they began to drive the person rather than the other way around. This reversal happens slowly, almost invisibly, and by the time people notice it, they feel trapped. Perhaps this suggests that the most important leadership we ever do is the leadership of our own daily lives. Deciding what gets our attention and for how long. Choosing which obligations to accept and which to decline. The person who does not direct their own work tends, eventually, to become exhausted by it. A long life may not be good enough, but a good life is long enough. This is Franklin returning to one of his most persistent themes, but now from a different angle. The quality of a life does not depend on its length. A life genuinely lived, with attention, with purpose, with love, with honest engagement, can feel complete even if it ends earlier than we would have chosen. And a long life that passes in numbness can feel, from the inside, terribly short. Many of us are postponing the good life for conditions that may never arrive, waiting to feel less tired, waiting to have more money, waiting until things settle down. Franklin is gently suggesting that the good life is not something we arrive at. It is something we choose today with what we already have. Creditors have better memories than debtors. Franklin wrote about money with the sharpness of someone who had borrowed it, owed it, and learned from both experiences. This particular line is about the unequal weight that obligation places on the two sides of a transaction. The person who is owed remembers. The person who owes often prefers to forget. This asymmetry creates friction, disappointment, and broken trust in relationships as much as in financial matters. This reminds us to notice the debts we carry, not just financial ones. The favor we accepted and never returned. The kindness we received and never acknowledged. The small IOUs of relationship that accumulate quietly beneath the surface. Franklin believed that clearing these debts, even symbolically, was a form of integrity. He that riseth late must trot all day. This is not really about sleeping in. It is about the cost of starting late, whether the start is physical or metaphorical. The person who arrives late to a task, a conversation, a decision, or a season of life often spends enormous energy just catching up to where they might have been with an earlier beginning. The starting point matters more than most of us want to admit. This invites us to consider where we might be starting late. Not in order to shame the delay, but to recognize that beginning now, even if it is later than ideal, is still better than beginning tomorrow. The trot is tiring, but the alternative, never starting, costs far more. The first degree of folly is to conceit oneself wise. Franklin was deeply suspicious of certainty. He had watched too many intelligent people become useless because they had stopped being genuinely curious. They had decided they already knew. And that decision, once made, tends to harden around itself until very little new understanding can get through. This reminds us that the wisest people we encounter are often the ones most aware of how much they do not know. There is a kind of spaciousness in genuine intellectual humility, a willingness to be surprised, corrected, expanded. The person who knows they do not know everything is always capable of learning something. The person who believes they already know enough has, in a real sense, already stopped. Plow deep while sluggards sleep. Franklin loved this image. The early worker, the deep effort, the others still dreaming while something real is being built. He was not glorifying overwork. He was making a different point. That depth of engagement, going past the surface of things, past the minimum required, tends to produce results that shallower effort simply cannot reach. Perhaps this suggests that the difference between good work and exceptional work is often not time. It is depth. The extra question asked. The extra draft written. The extra mile of thought invested before delivering something to the world. Franklin was always interested in going deeper than expected. Nothing gives a person so much advantage over another as to remain always cool and unruffled under all circumstances. Franklin had a famous composure. People who encountered him in negotiation and debate noted that he seemed almost impossible to destabilize. He did not achieve this naturally. He worked at it. He had been, in his youth, impulsive and argumentative. And he trained himself, gradually, toward steadiness. Because he saw that the person who remained calm held a kind of power that the reactive person simply did not. This invites us to consider our own reactivity. The places where we tend to lose composure in traffic, in conflict, when someone criticizes our work. Franklin is not asking us to suppress our emotions. He is asking us to practice the discipline of not letting every emotional wave result in an action we did not choose. The pause between feeling and response is where composure lives. The use of money is all the advantage there is in having it. Franklin was wealthy by the end of his life. And this line suggests something about how he thought about wealth, not as a status symbol or a measure of worth, but as a tool. Money that is hoarded and never used produces nothing for the person holding it. Money spent on things that do not serve the life you actually want is equally wasted. The value is in the using, and using it well requires knowing what you actually want. This reminds us to ask ourselves what our resources, not just financial, but temporal and energetic, are actually in service of. We accumulate things, often without a clear sense of what they are for, and the accumulation begins to feel hollow. Franklin believed that clarity about purpose precedes the meaningful use of anything. If you want something done, ask a busy person. This sounds paradoxical. Why would someone already stretched be more likely to help? Franklin had noticed something true about how capable, engaged people work. They have systems. They have energy. They have a relationship with getting things done that the idle person does not. Saying yes to one more thing for the genuinely busy person is not as difficult as it sounds. This invites us to consider our own relationship with commitment. Some of us believe that the answer is always less, fewer obligations, fewer responsibilities, more protected space. But Franklin observed that real engagement tends to generate more capacity, not less. The person fully alive to their work and relationships often has more to give than the person who is perpetually conserving. A good conscience is a continual Christmas. This is one of Franklin's warmest observations. The feeling of Christmas generosity, warmth, peace, the sense that things are right is not something that comes once a year and disappears. It is available to the person who is living in alignment with their values. The person who has been honest, who has done the good they set out to do, who has nothing significant to hide. That inner quiet is its own ongoing celebration. Many of us know what it feels like to carry something unresolved, a half-truth, a betrayed trust, an avoided conversation. That low-grade unease is the opposite of what Franklin is describing. And this reminds us that the investment in living with integrity pays a kind of interior dividend that nothing external can replicate. Hide not your talents. They were made for use. What is a sundial in the shade? Franklin had no patience for potential that stayed hidden. He believed that gifts were given to be expressed. That the person who buries a talent out of fear, out of false modesty, out of the belief that their contribution doesn't matter, is failing not just themselves, but the world that could have benefited. This invites us to consider what we might be keeping in the shade. The skill we downplay. The perspective we silence before it reaches the room. The thing we could offer but hold back because we are not sure it is good enough. Franklin is gently asking whether the world might be better if you let it see what you can do. If your riches are yours, why don't you take them with you to the other world? This is Franklin the moralist, using a logical absurdity to point at a real truth. We treat our possessions as though they are fundamentally ours, as though we earned them absolutely and they belong to us completely. But the inability to take anything past a certain threshold reminds us that possession is, at bottom, temporary stewardship. Everything we call ours is borrowed from a larger story. Perhaps this suggests that the question about what we own is less interesting than the question of what we do with what we have while we have it. The legacy of a life is not the balance in an account. It is what we invested in people, in ideas, in communities, in small acts of generosity that outlasted us. Experience keeps a dear school, but fools will learn in no other. Franklin believed in learning from experience. But he was not entirely romanticizing it. Because experience is expensive. Its lessons arrive after the cost has already been paid. The person who can learn from books, from other people's mistakes, from careful observation rather than personal disaster, that person gets the lesson at a significant discount. This reminds us that one of the great gifts of paying attention to other lives through reading, through listening, through genuine conversation, is the opportunity to absorb wisdom that costs someone else dearly. We do not need to make every mistake ourselves. Some of the most valuable education is inherited, if we are willing to receive it. He that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged. This is one of Franklin's most counterintuitive observations, and psychology has since confirmed it. The act of giving, of doing something kind, tends to produce warmth toward the recipient. Not because we are calculating, but because we invest meaning in the things we have already invested effort in. When someone does us a favor, they become more sympathetic to us because they have already demonstrated their belief in us through action. This invites us to consider our relationships differently. Sometimes, rather than trying to win someone over by doing things for them, we might allow them to do something small for us. The vulnerability of receiving graciously can create connection in ways that relentless giving sometimes cannot. All mankind is divided into three classes: those that are immovable, those that are movable, and those that move. Franklin saw this distinction clearly because he was himself unmistakably a mover. Not just physically or professionally, but in the sense of being someone who initiated, who made things happen, who did not wait for the world to arrange itself. He was genuinely curious about what separated the movers from the rest. And he concluded that the difference was less about ability than about disposition. Perhaps this suggests that the category we inhabit is, to a significant degree, chosen. Not easily changed, but changeable. The person who has spent years being immovable can decide at any point to become movable. And the movable can decide to begin moving. Franklin's own life was evidence that the trajectory of a life can shift dramatically when its subject decides it will. Rather, go to bed supperless than rise in debt. Franklin wrote extensively about debt and saw it as one of the primary mechanisms by which people lose their freedom. The debt may seem small at the point of taking it on, but its weight accumulates. Its interest grows. And the person who owes begins, gradually, to make decisions based on what they owe rather than what they value. The loss of freedom is the real cost, not the money. This reminds us that debt in its broadest sense includes more than financial obligations. The commitment made under social pressure that we do not truly want to honor. The relationship maintained out of obligation rather than genuine care. Franklin valued freedom highly enough to sacrifice comfort for it. The question he is implicitly asking is whether we value it as much. Those who give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. This is one of Franklin's most famous political statements, and it has only grown more resonant over time. He was not speaking abstractly. He was speaking from the experience of someone who had watched governments make exactly this bargain with their citizens, trading genuine freedom for the feeling of security, and watched it end badly for everyone. This invites us to consider where in our personal lives we make the same trade, where we silence a part of ourselves to be accepted, where we conform to avoid conflict. where we give up the authentic thing for the safer version. Franklin believed liberty was worth protecting at real cost, and that the person who trades it away in small increments wakes up one day to find it gone. The heart of a fool is in his mouth, but the mouth of a wise man is in his heart. There is a beautiful inversion in this line. The fool speaks before thinking, the mouth runs ahead of the heart, ahead of the meaning, ahead of the understanding. The wise person speaks from somewhere deeper, from a place that has processed, felt, considered. The words come out shaped by something genuine. Many of us recognize the fool in this description, from our own worst moments, the quick retort, the unfiltered reaction, the thing said in frustration that we immediately wish we could take back. This reminds us that the pause between feeling and speaking is not weakness or slowness. It is the space where wisdom lives. Do good to your friends to keep them. Do good to your enemies to win them. Franklin had political enemies throughout his life, and his instinct was almost always to disarm rather than retaliate. He found creative ways to turn antagonists into allies. He asked them for favors. He praised them publicly. He treated them with more generosity than they expected. And it worked with surprising frequency. This invites us to consider our own difficult relationships. The person at work who seems to oppose you. The family member who is hard to reach. The instinct toward defensiveness or retaliation is understandable. But Franklin's approach suggests a counterintuitive alternative. What if you treated them as though they were already on your side and let that treatment do its work? The doors of wisdom are never shut, but the windows of opportunity often close. Wisdom is always available. The capacity to learn, to reflect, to grow, these remain open as long as we are alive. But specific opportunities have timing. The chance to start that project, to repair that relationship, to pursue that dream before the circumstances change, these do not wait indefinitely. Franklin lived with an acute awareness of this distinction. Perhaps this suggests that a balanced life attends to both. It stays connected to the slow, patient work of becoming wiser. And it also pays attention to the moments when something specific must be acted upon now while the window is still open. Both kinds of awareness matter. And losing either one costs us something real. Whatever is begun in anger ends in shame. Franklin wrote this from experience. He had seen, repeatedly in himself and in others, how actions initiated in anger tend to produce outcomes that embarrass. The angry letter that escalates a conflict that patience might have resolved. The impulsive decision made in a moment of fury that closes doors that were still open. Anger has its information, but it makes a very poor advisor. This reminds us that the intensity of a feeling in the moment does not always indicate the wisdom of acting on it. Some of our most powerful emotions are pointing at something real and important, but they may be pointing at it from a distorted angle. Franklin's practice was to let the anger tell him that something mattered, and then to decide what to do about it in a calmer hour. Trouble springs from idleness, and grievous toil from needless ease. Franklin noticed a paradox that still holds. The person who avoids difficulty tends to encounter more of it, not less. Idleness creates its own kind of suffering boredom, listlessness, the creeping sense that life is passing without meaning. And the ease we seek so desperately often produces a restlessness that is harder to bear than honest effort would have been. This invites us to consider the relationship between discomfort and vitality in our own lives. Where are you avoiding something that might actually energize you? The challenge you keep postponing. The project that is just outside your comfort zone. Sometimes, the thing that sounds like hardship turns out to be the thing that makes you feel most alive. Many a man thinks he is buying pleasure when he is really selling himself a slave to it. Franklin had a sophisticated understanding of desire and its consequences. He enjoyed life's pleasures, but he watched, with clear eyes, how quickly pleasure becomes compulsion. How the thing we reach for to feel better can gradually become the thing we cannot live without. And in that dependence, we lose a kind of freedom that we did not value until it was gone. This reminds us to look honestly at our own relationship with the things we reliably reach for when we are stressed, bored, or lonely. Not to condemn them, but to ask whether we are choosing them or whether they are beginning to choose us. Franklin's standard was not asceticism. It was sovereignty, the maintenance of genuine choice over one's own life. He that's secure is not safe. This is Franklin the strategist. He believed that complacency was one of the great risks. That the feeling of security, when it causes us to stop preparing, stop thinking, stop paying attention, that feeling becomes, paradoxically, a source of vulnerability. The person who believes they have nothing left to learn, nothing left to build, nothing left to protect that person, has stopped living in the way that keeps them truly safe. Perhaps this suggests that a certain productive unease is not anxiety to be eliminated, but intelligence to be honored. The awareness that things could change. That what works today may not work tomorrow. That staying alert is itself a form of care for our relationships, our work, and our own continued growth. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. Franklin understood this as a political truth. But it is also a deeply personal one. The voice that is silenced first is always the most inconvenient voice, the one that asks uncomfortable questions, that names things others prefer not to name, that refuses to go along with the comfortable consensus. That voice, inside us and around us, is worth protecting. This invites us to consider the places in our own lives where certain things go unsaid. Not out of tact or timing, but out of fear. The fear of standing out. The fear of being wrong. The fear of disrupting a dynamic that is comfortable, even if it is not honest. Franklin believed that the freedom to speak and the courage to exercise it was foundational to everything else. Fatigue is the best pillow. Franklin believed in the virtue of honest tiredness. The exhaustion that comes at the end of a day, genuinely spent in work, in thought, in engagement with the world, that exhaustion is its own reward. It produces a quality of rest that is simply unavailable to the person who has spent the day avoiding, drifting, and doing less than they were capable of. This reminds us that one of the underrated sources of genuine peace is the feeling at the end of a day of knowing we gave something real. Not that we did everything, not that we achieved some external standard, but that we were actually present to our hours, that we engaged, that we tried. The sleep of the honestly tired person is different from the sleep of the restless one. God heals, and the doctor takes the fee. Franklin was a close observer of medicine for his era. He had great respect for genuine healing and a skeptical eye for the theater of expertise. This line is not an attack on doctors. It is an observation about credit and causation, about how easily the person present at a recovery claims responsibility for it, and about how the most important forces in life often work invisibly, without taking a bow. This invites us to consider where we give and receive credit in our own lives. The invisible work that makes visible success possible. The person in the background who did not get acknowledged. The circumstances and good fortune we absorbed without thanking. Franklin believed that genuine humility, especially when things go well, was a mark of real character. Keep your eyes wide open before marriage and half shut afterwards. This is Franklin at his most practical and perhaps his most honest about love. The initial assessment of a partner, done with clear eyes, with attention to what is really there, rather than only what we hope is there, is genuinely important. But once committed, the art of the relationship shifts. It requires a different kind of seeing, one that makes space for the imperfect, the unchangeable, the human. This reminds us that love and clarity are not opposites, but they operate differently at different stages. The beginning asks for honesty. The middle and the long years ask for something closer to grace, the decision to see the whole person with generosity without losing sight of what is true. Franklin knew that relationships require both kinds of vision, applied in the right sequence. Happiness depends more on the inward disposition of mind than on outward circumstances. Franklin had been poor and wealthy, famous and obscure, loved and opposed. And he came to this conclusion not from optimism but from observation. The people he saw, who were genuinely happy consistently, not just in the good moments, were the ones who had cultivated a certain inner relationship with their lives. A posture of gratitude. A capacity for meaning-making. A willingness to find something worthwhile in the present. Perhaps this is the most important thing Franklin observed across a long and eventful life. That the world cannot give us contentment from the outside. It can create conditions that make contentment easier or harder. But the disposition, the inner arrangement, is something we have to cultivate ourselves every day, regardless of what the outside offers. Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. Franklin held this view with a depth that sometimes surprises people who know him only as a founding father. He was deeply troubled by slavery and wrote against it powerfully in the last years of his life, eventually becoming president of an abolitionist society. He understood that moral progress requires people to feel genuinely, not performatively, the weight of injustice that they are not personally experiencing. This invites us to consider where, in the world we inhabit, we might be maintaining a comfortable distance from something that deserves our attention. Not with guilt, but with the question Franklin is implicitly asking: what would it mean to care about this as if it were happening to someone I love? Speak with contempt of no man. Franklin learned this through decades of political life. He had seen how contempt, even when deserved, tends to backfire. It hardens opposition. It closes doors. It produces a brittleness in the speaker that eventually isolates them. And beyond strategy, there is a deeper point here. Contempt is a form of dismissal, a refusal to grant full humanity to another person. And that refusal, over time, diminishes the person who holds it. This reminds us that the quality of our regard for others, even others we find difficult, even others who have genuinely wronged us, says something important about who we are becoming. Not that we must approve of everything, but that something is lost in us when we allow contempt to replace honest, if critical, engagement. Laws too gentle are seldom obeyed. Too severe, seldom executed. Franklin observed this in governments, but the principle reaches into our personal lives just as cleanly. The standard we set for ourselves that asks too little becomes meaningless. But the standard that asks too much becomes an occasion for guilt rather than growth. Neither extreme produces the actual change we are hoping for. Perhaps this suggests that the wisdom in self-discipline, as in governance, is in the calibration, the expectation that is both meaningful and humanly possible, high enough to require something real, forgiving enough to survive imperfect compliance. Franklin found this balance difficult. He failed against his own standards regularly. And he kept trying anyway, which is perhaps the whole point. A life of leisure and a life of laziness are two different things. Franklin was not a Puritan about rest. He believed in genuine leisure, in the cultivation of interests beyond the practical, in conversation and friendship and play. What he was suspicious of was the passivity that masquerades as rest, the numbing out, the drift, the hours that pass without any genuine engagement, pleasure, or renewal. This invites us to consider the quality of our rest. Are you actually resting, genuinely restoring yourself, or are you in a kind of suspended animation that neither rests you nor moves you? Franklin believed the distinction mattered. Real leisure is active in its own way. It fills something. It gives something back. It leaves you more yourself than when it began. He that is of the opinion money will do everything may well be suspected of doing everything for money. Franklin watched wealthy men carefully over the course of his life, and he noticed a pattern. The person who organizes their values entirely around money tends to see everything through that lens: relationships, reputation, opportunity. And that narrow organizing principle, over time, becomes obvious to everyone around them. The values by which we measure everything end up measuring us. This reminds us to be thoughtful about what sits at the center of our lives. Not because money is unimportant, Franklin himself understood its practical weight very clearly, but because what we serve becomes, in a deep sense, what we are. And most of us, on reflection, want to be known for more than what we were willing to do for financial gain. Right injuries in dust, benefits in marble. This is one of Franklin's most beautiful lines. The practice he is recommending is the practice of a very particular kind of memory, one that releases the harms done to us while preserving the kindnesses received. Not denial, not pretending injuries did not happen, but choosing not to carry them forward as the primary narrative. Many of us do exactly the opposite. The slight stays vivid for years. The kindness fades quickly. This inversion, keeping the good and releasing the wound, is not naive. It is a discipline. It is the choice to live more fully in the experience of what has been given to us than in the experience of what has been taken. Franklin believed this discipline was worth cultivating, and its effects over a lifetime are profound. And now, we arrive somewhere quieter. You have been listening for a while now. Perhaps the room around you has changed since we began. Perhaps it is later than you thought, or earlier. Perhaps you are more tired now, or somehow more awake. Wherever you are, whatever city, whatever hour, whatever moment in your life, I want you to stay with just one thing from today's conversation. One line from Franklin that landed somewhere in your body rather than just your mind. You do not need to analyze it or explain it. Simply let it sit with you the way a stone settles at the bottom of a clear river. Still, present, weighted with something worth keeping. Franklin was not a saint. He was deeply, recognizably human. He struggled with the virtues he admired. He fell short of the standards he set. He made mistakes he could not entirely repair. And yet he kept trying every day with that list of virtues, with that journal, with that relentless curiosity about how a person might actually live better. Perhaps that is the most honest and useful thing we can take from his life. Not that he succeeded perfectly, but that he took the question seriously. That he believed the question was worth asking every single day until the very end. You are asking it too, by being here. And that matters more than you may realize. Where are you listening from? Please leave a comment. Thank you for listening. This is Life Wisdom.